As a Jedi, Traya was a noted historian and instructor, distinguished by her unusual teaching style and philosophies, and having trained such notables as the Jedi Revan, whose legacy would come to haunt her. When the Jedi High Council refused to allow the Order to become involved in the Mandalorian Wars, a splinter faction of knights led by Revan, and including all of Traya's former pupils, rebelled against this decree and assumed command of the Republic military. They all fell to the dark side of the Force, joining a revived Sith Order under the newly christened Darth Revan. One of the Jedi Council's first acts in response was to disavow Traya, as her teachings were widely blamed for the fall of so many, leading Traya to quietly withdraw from the Jedi Order. Wandering the galaxy, Traya was drawn to the Traya's Academy on Malachor V, where she was welcomed by Revan's Sith assassins, who presented her with various Sith texts. Her faith in the light already wavering, Traya's exposure to the dark knowledge of the Sith completed her conversion, and she was reborn Darth Traya, the Lord of Betrayal. With the destruction of the Sith leadership at the hands of a redeemed Revan, who subsequently disappeared into the unknown regions, Traya stepped up and assumed leadership of a listless Sith Order, ruling as part of the Sith Triumvirate alongside the rage-driven animate corpse Darth Sion and the life-devouring void Darth Nihilus. Under Traya's direction, the revitalized Sith Order changed tact completely, waging a covert and highly successful campaign of assassination against the Jedi, picking them off one by one rather than engaging them en masse. However, as Traya herself noted, to be united by hatred is a fragile alliance at best. Stripped of her powers by Nihilus and beaten to within an inch of her life by Sion, Traya only narrowly escaped her wrathful former apprentices. Once again an outcast, Traya sought out the Jedi Exile, one of Revan's former lieutenants and the only member of his crusade who didn't fall to the dark side. Reassuming the role of mentor, Traya instructed the Exile in her own unique blend of Jedi and Sith philosophy, while also rebuilding her own powers, using her position in the Exile's entourage to subtly manipulate events. She masterminded the gathering of the surviving Jedi Masters so she could eliminate them, and enabled the deaths of Nihilus and Sion at the Exile's hand, using the revelation of her own identity as Darth Traya to lure her pupil into a confrontation in the Traya's Academy. This fight proved to be her last, and Darth Traya was defeated. However, everything had proceeded as she had desired, and the new Jedi Order spearheaded by the Exile would be forever changed by the influence and ideals of the Sith Lord of Betrayal. The former apprentice of the Jedi archivist Jocasta Nu, Jerec was trained as a Jedi during the decades preceding the Clone Wars. Becoming a Jedi archaeologist, he was driven by a thirst for knowledge and lore, one of his primary goals being the location of the Valley of the Jedi, the ancient battleground on Ruusan, where the Jedi Army of Light led by Lord Hoth defeated the Sith Brotherhood of Darkness led by Lord Khan. Training Amisa Darius to knighthood, Jerec attained the rank of Jedi Master, and held a prominent position in the Order as both one of their foremost scholars and as the student of a former Jedi High Council Master. However, he was not satisfied with this, and desired more power for himself. Shortly before the Clone Wars, Jerec led a team of Jedi archaeologists out into the unknown regions in search of ancient Jedi sites and artifacts, though Jerec had the ulterior motive of locating non-Jedi sources of knowledge. As a result, Jerec did not participate in the Clone Wars, and was able to avoid becoming a victim of the Great Jedi Purge, though his status within the Order made him a priority target to the newly formed Galactic Empire. Upon his return to former Republic space, he was captured by Antonis Tremaine, a member of the Jedi-hunting Inquisitorius, and was offered a choice between embracing the dark side and joining with the Empire, or dying as a Jedi. The choice was an easy one for Jerec, and he not only joined the Inquisitorius, but personally tracked down and slew many of his former Jedi comrades. He also experienced a great deal of success turning Jedi survivors to the dark side and recruiting them for the Empire, though he secretly made a point of cultivating a personal allegiance to himself, building a cadre of dark Jedi followers. Jerec's other duties included searching out Jedi and Sith artifacts and lore, and as one of the foremost scholars within the Empire, he came to answer directly to Emperor Palpatine. Though a valuable servant, Jerec's ambitions made him a potential threat, and Palpatine kept close tabs on the fallen Jedi, and had on at least one occasion restricted Jerec's access to the Sith lore he so desperately craved. Palpatine's death at the Battle of Endor gave Jerec the opening he needed to put his plans into action. Gathering his resources and establishing himself as a warlord, he swore false allegiances to the Imperial splinter faction known as the Pentastar Alignment, the Sith cult known as the Prophets of the Dark Side, and to the surviving Imperial leadership under the reborn Emperor on Biss, playing all three factions against the middle while drawing on their combined resources to fuel his hunt for the Valley of the Jedi, now determined to use the powerful Force Nexus at the site to amplify his own Dark Force powers in a bid for the Imperial throne. Jerec's plans were halted by Kyle Katarn, a rebel agent turned Jedi trainee, who killed off his Dark Jedi followers and confronted Jerec within the valley itself. With his newfound Jedi powers, Katarn was able to break Jerec's connection to the dark side, weakening him severely, allowing Katarn to cut him down in the ensuing duel. The power of the valley granted Jerec near omniscience, yet all he gained through this clarity was knowledge of the eternal torment that awaited him in the netherworld of the Force. So my initial plan with this video was to do Darth Traya versus Count Dooku, but after researching Jerec, I realized that he was both better competition and a more interesting opponent. What fascinated me about this matchup are the combination of strong similarities and stark reversals between Traya and Jerec, both being academics who abandoned the Jedi Order due to a desire for forbidden knowledge, and both being unique figures who didn't fit in with their peers. Traya, with her focus on duplicity and subtle manipulation, functioned very much like a rule of two Sith Lord, which made her ahead of her time and ultimately an anomaly. Jerec, by contrast, was a throwback, a dark side warlord who ruled through fear and power, and though quite cunning, his emphasis was on domination rather than deception. Traya the schemer living in an era of warlords, and Jerec the warlord living in an era of schemers. Special thanks to the Comic Vine users Shooting Nova and Zappin87 for your Darth Traya and Jerec respect threads. You have no idea how much they helped me along in researching these characters. On a side note, according to Wikipedia, the 27th issue of Star Wars The Official Starships and Vehicles Collection confirms Jerec as a Makashi specialist, but since I can't obtain a copy for myself and check it myself, I consider it to be in question. Speaking from experience, this wouldn't be the first time someone on Wikipedia cited a false source in order to fool people into buying into some fan-made trivia. That being said, I will be proceeding under the assumption that Jerec is a Makashi specialist, so correct me if I'm wrong. And with all of that out of the way, allow me to present Darth Traya versus Inquisitor Jarek. As a Jedi, Traya was noted primarily as an academic and philosopher rather than as a swordswoman, an element that I believe remained consistent during her days as a Sith Lord. That being said, underestimating Darth Traya would be a fatal mistake. Traya demonstrated a strong conceptual understanding of all 7 forms of lightsaber combat, and herself favored forms 1 through 3, Shicho, Makashi, and Surisu. Shicho was the tutorial style of the Jedi Order, its simplistic blade work making it a good fallback option and ideal for crowd control. Makashi was dedicated to lightsaber dueling, emphasizing sophisticated cut-and-thrust swordplay. Surisu was a purely defensive art designed specifically for blast deflection, based around smooth and efficient transitions between tight blocking positions. However, as noted in the Knights of the Old Republic campaign guide, her primary martial art was Trakata. An alternative lightsaber discipline, Trakata was based around taking advantage of the retractable blade, turning the blade on and off in combat in order to confuse adversaries and bypass their defenses, an emphasis very much in line with Traya's duplicitous nature. Her use of forms 1 through 3 provided her with a complementary array of skills that left her well equipped to handle herself in virtually any combat situation, from one-on-one lightsaber duels to pitched battlefield engagements. Based on the information presented, I believe that Traya's basic lightsaber technique would be most easily compared to that of old Ben Kenobi, refined and elegant, worthy of a master, but at the same time conventional and simplistic. It was the inclusion of Trakata that made her so unpredictable. Her use of this technique reflected her total understanding of the lightsaber as a weapon, and as the application of Trakata represented a major calculated risk, every split second where that lightsaber is inactive is a split second where defense is impossible, she would have needed to develop exceptional levels of precision and timing to make it workable. This was backed up by her strong integration of her Force talents, typically Force Lightning and Force Fear, to quickly kill or disable her adversaries, as well as her masterful application of telekinetic lightsaber combat. I'll elaborate more on that later, though I will say that it represents her skill at combative multitasking. Additionally, she also had some skill in the use of vibroblades, and is known to have wielded a saber staff as a Jedi, though she opted for a standard red-hued lightsaber after her fall to the dark side, and was forced to abandon the saber staff entirely after the loss of her hand. However, this disadvantage did not make Traya any less of a threat, as her use of complementary forms allowed her to effectively answer anything that was used against her, while her own unorthodox style and tactics allowed her to effectively undermine her opponents. Psychological warfare was Darth Traya's bread and butter. A clear adherent of the Sith Dun Mok tactic, she was all about emotional manipulation and fear, but most of all, deception. On a broad scale, these tactics allowed the Sith Order under her leadership to execute the first Jedi Purge, isolating the Jedi and picking them off one by one, rather than engaging the Order en masse, and in the process spreading confusion and paranoia amongst the survivors. In smaller scale engagements, she relied on calculated verbal taunts, the showboating of Force abilities, as well as Trakata itself. That last one especially indicates Traya's use of shock and awe tactics, suggesting that she has been influenced to a certain degree by Exar Kun. Though this is merely speculation on my part, I believe that Traya's conduct in battle was based around incremental escalation, starting things off with standard lightsaber techniques to get a feel for the opponent, and then working in Trakata and Force abilities as needed, with telekinetic lightsaber combat as an absolute last resort. While Traya's tactics and skills were very well conceived and proven effective, they also demonstrated her primary weakness as a fighter. Like a traditional Nyman specialist, Traya's balanced skill set allowed her to handle basically anything that is thrown at her, but none of these skills were advanced to the point where she could dominate with them. And while her attempts to compensate by incorporating unorthodox tactics and techniques into her approach have been overwhelmingly successful, it is clear that she would experience major difficulties if ever confronted by an opponent who could answer the unorthodox. When analyzing and breaking down Jarek's skills with the lightsaber, much attention must be paid to his final duel with Kyle Katarn. If the fight is to be taken at face value, then either Katarn attained the status of lightsaber master within days of first picking up a lightsaber, or Jerec himself was a rank amateur who was in turn defeated by another rank amateur, neither of which I believe to be true. As a Jedi Master of the Old Order and a veteran Jedi Hunter, Jerec by necessity would have needed to have been at least a moderately capable swordsman. While Katarn was a novice in the ways of the Force at the time, the Dark Forces novella detailed that he did possess pre-existing sword training that he simply applied to the lightsaber, skills that were further enhanced by visions of the knowledge and memories of one of the ancient Jedi who participated in the Battle of Ruusan, so he was not an amateur duelist. Additionally, the novella describes Katarn as defeating Jerec by using the Force to create a cocoon of light side energy around the fallen Jedi, protecting him from the dark power of the Rusanian Nexus, as well as interfering with his ability to call upon the dark side of the Force. Applying this mechanic to the fight, this would mean that rather than being amped up by the power of the Valley of the Jedi, Jerec was instead fighting at a severe handicap. Given how much of a challenge he still posed to Katarn despite being so far reduced, I would rank Jarek's native skills as roughly equivalent to those of a mid-level Jedi Council Master, such as Eth Koth, while Katarn himself was on the level with advanced Jedi Knights, such as Ayla Secura or Obi-Wan Kenobi at the start of the Clone Wars. Jerec was a master of the Makashi form, though I do not believe that he specialized in this discipline exclusively. Rather than hold to Makashi's linear cut-and-thrust swordplay, Jerec instead relied on circular hack-and-slash style attacks, which indicated that he at the very least heavily revised the form to better suit his needs, or as I believe, hybridized it with another technique. As a lifelong academic and former Jedi archaeologist, I believe that he was also a student of Nyman, the jack-of-all-trades lightsaber form. Jerec likely practiced Nyman exclusively as a Jedi, studying Makashi after becoming an Inquisitor in order to better optimize himself for hunting and killing Jedi, and over time, Form 2 replaced Form 6 as his primary discipline. The practical benefit of a Makashi-Nyman hybrid was a balanced and efficient style that could be effectively applied in any situation while still providing an edge in a lightsaber duel, the best basis for comparison being Eth Koth's fighting style. Jarek's own style was described as bird-like by Ku Ran when they fought on board the Vengeance. While he would fight with both hands if necessary, he overwhelmingly favored a one-handed grip, pairing off elegant fencing-style parries with sweeping circular attacks. Though a formidable offensive duelist, Jerec heavily emphasized lightsaber defense, and preferred to retaliate with expertly integrated Force abilities, typically Force Lightning or Force Destruction. This practice was in line with his tactics, which were based around achieving the greatest result with the least amount of effort. Why use a longsword when a dagger will suffice? Much like Darth Traya, Jerec also heavily emphasized psychological warfare, though his primary targets were oftentimes his own subordinates rather than his enemies. Appropriately for such a treacherous individual, Jerec was extremely wary of betrayal, believing that his followers wielded more power than they were aware of, and that the only way to protect his own position was to keep them disorganized and fearful of his capabilities. He had little difficulty applying these skills to combat, and his conduct in battle was very similar to that of Count Dooku, using shock and intimidation to keep his adversaries off balance, breaking them before engaging them. For all intents and purposes, Jerec was Dooku light. He was a cunning and devious fighter who skillfully undermined and dismantled his adversaries, but on the other hand, he was a lightweight who couldn't handle a head-to-head confrontation and crumbled when put under any serious pressure. Fortunately for him, Darth Traya suffered from the same weakness and was in no position to put anyone under that kind of pressure. In their choice of fighting disciplines, Traya and Jerec demonstrated a common focus on undermining their adversaries rather than overpowering them, but they achieved this through very different means. While I would argue that Traya's method was more sophisticated and produced better results, it would be ineffective against Jerec simply because Makashi is the perfect foil for Trakata. Trakata is only effective at close quarters, where Makashi is primarily focused on maintaining a consistent distance between the combatants, keeping the opponent at range, and the defensive openings created by an inactive blade would be too much of a risk against such a high-caliber Form 2 specialist. With Trakata off the table, none of Traya's other skills were advanced to the point where Jerec couldn't deal with them. Trying to use Shicho against a Makashi specialist is nothing less than suicide. Her own knowledge of Makashi would merely allow her to contend with Jerec, and Surisu would be nothing more than a delaying tactic. To be clear, Traya's disadvantage is due purely to logistical factors, her native skill level being easily equal to, if not superior to Jerec's, meaning she could still engage him and pose a significant threat. However, a pure lightsaber duel between these two would ultimately be Jerec's game, especially given Jerec's heavy emphasis on lightsaber defense. Inquisitor Jerec gets the edge as a martial artist and lightsaber duelist. In-game, Darth Traya is one of the tougher combatants, though I would attribute this hardiness to a heavy use of force-based physical augmentation. An elderly human female, Traya was noted for her haggard appearance, though how much of this was the result of mere old age versus the physical deterioration brought on by the dark side is unclear. Despite this, she was a vigorous old woman and quite handy in a fight. I'd place her raw physical ability as being on the level with Count Dooku. Exceptional agility and dexterity for one so old, but her strength and endurance being severely compromised. Unfortunately, Traya was further held back by certain handicaps. She was physically blind, having allowed her eyes to atrophy from disuse due to her reliance on force sight, and she was short a hand, her left having been amputated by Darth Sion during an ill-fated confrontation on board the Harbinger. While her mastery of force sight made her blindness a non-issue, her combat effectiveness was seriously affected by her missing limb, forcing her to fight exclusively one-handed and hampering her ability to wield her weapon, most notably forcing her to completely abandon the use of the double-bladed lightsaber. Her attempts to compensate by steadying her weapon with telekinesis were only partially successful. But for all of these shortcomings, Darth Traya was ultimately quite a robust old woman and did not go to pieces under strain. Inquisitor Jarek was a Miraluka male of uncertain age, with estimates placing him anywhere from his mid-50s to his late 70s. As he was a Jedi Master of high standing when the Order fell, I believe that he would have been in his 40s during the Clone Wars, which would put him well into his 70s post-Battle of Endor. Assuming that I'm correct, then Jerec did a good job of staving off the degenerative effects of the dark side, retaining the appearance and capabilities of a middle-aged man, though he was noted for being so thin as to appear emaciated. However, I see this lack of muscle mass being the result of his lightsaber training regimen rather than any physical deterioration, as the nature of his fighting style meant that the attributes he would be most concerned with developing and maintaining would be agility and dexterity, not strength or bulk. As a Mira Luca, Jerec was born without eyes, an adaptation brought about by his people's universal force sensitivity and natural affinity for force sight. On an evolutionary scale, this was evidently a recent development, as the Mira Luca still possessed empty eye sockets, which were customarily concealed by facial coverings or headdresses, Jerec himself favoring a close-fitting leather blindfold. He was further distinguished by the simple Sith-style tattoos at the corners of his mouth. All in all, while not overwhelmingly powerful, Jerec was quick and agile, very well suited for the type of combat he favored, and a surprisingly imposing presence, despite his light build. This conclusion is fairly simple. Darth Traya is a tough old bird, but she is held back by her age and her amputee status, being too prideful to get a damn prosthetic. By contrast, Jerec retained the use of both hands and boasted the physical capabilities of a man decades younger than Traya. Their shared blindness is a non-issue. Inquisitor Jerec gets the physical edge. As a Jedi Master, Traya was a noted academic, though her unorthodox beliefs made her something of a pariah within the Order. This was clearly not without reason, considering that her morally relativistic teachings led all but one of her students to fall to the dark side and join the Sith. And by that same token, the birth of Darth Traya was no surprise and no accident. Though a cunning and skilled lightsaber duelist, Traya functioned primarily as a Force wielder, and it was her primary means of expression both in life and in battle, to the point where she relied on it to perceive the world around her, her constant use of Force sight having caused her actual eyes to basically die. This is especially ironic given how much her teachings vilified the Force and its will, an irony which did not escape her. Traya's approach to all things, particularly in regards to her study and application of the Force, was based around keeping her options open. Accordingly, she studied every branch of arcane knowledge available to her and built up an expansive skill set. Most Force powers were divided into three categories: Control, Sense, and Alter. Control abilities were based around directing the Force inwards to strengthen the body, and Traya's capabilities here were extremely advanced. The basic control abilities were Altus Sopor, Curado Salva, and Tutaminis. Altus Sopor was a meditative technique intended to improve Force focus, and a clear favorite of Traya's, given that she spent almost all of her free time meditating. Curado Salva was a power used to refresh and heal the body, and was one of Traya's specialties. She had used it to treat moderate injuries in both herself and others while in the field, to the point where she has revived subjects who were near death, and has used its most extreme application, the hibernation trance, to recover from severe wounds. After she joined the Sith, she learned the dark side variant of this ability, known simply as Dark Healing. Tutaminis allowed a practitioner to absorb, deflect, or otherwise diffuse harmful bursts of energy. Though a basic power, it was typically limited to utility applications, as its combative uses were extremely difficult to master. Traya has used it to deflect blaster fire with her bare hand, and was capable of using it to defend against Force lightning. On a more advanced level, Traya has used the Force to enhance her physical capabilities in order to perform the superhuman feats the Jedi and Sith combatants alike were renowned for. This aptitude was bolstered by her active usage of Force speed and dark rage. For utility, she mastered breath control, allowing her to survive for extended periods of time in poisonous atmospheres. In fact, I would argue that much of her considerable physical resiliency was thanks to her use of the Force to strengthen her body. Sense abilities were based around extending one's awareness into the surrounding Force, gaining a deeper awareness of one's environment. Traya's most obvious ability in this area was Force Sight, which she used in lieu of eyesight, perceiving the world exclusively through the Force. The basic sense abilities were Tactus Otium and Prima Vitae. Tactus Otium was the passive sense of the Force itself, allowing one to sense the general Force signature associated with a specific area, which she used to ascertain the general state and conditions of the worlds she visited throughout her travels. Prima Vitae was the ability to detect and locate living creatures, even discerning their intentions and whether they are a friend or an enemy. Traya used this power to detect the presence of Aten Rand on board the Paragus mining station and peg him as a potential ally, and later on to detect the presence of Darth Nihilus's Sith followers on Duxon. More advanced sense abilities included the magnification of the body's senses, projective telepathy, and the obscure TIE Vordrax. Traya taught the Jedi Exile to magnify her natural hearing, allowing her to detect every noise made by the various members of her party on board the Ebon Hawk, eavesdropping on their activities. Telepathy was Traya's primary focus and likely her most developed power. She has done everything from influencing the thoughts and decisions of subjects to clouding their memories and perceptions, to the point where they would fail to register her presence even when she was standing next to them. Notably, she was capable of reaching into the minds of both strong-willed individuals and even Jedi. In addition to playing mind games with virtually every member of the Ebon Hawk's crew, she evaded detection by the Jedi Council by clouding their thoughts of her from afar. In combat, she heavily favored the use of Force fear and horror. TIE Vordrax, or postcognition, allowed a practitioner to experience visions of the past associated with certain objects or places, a notable practitioner of this ability being the Clone Wars-era Jedi Master Quinlan Vos. Intriguingly, this is one power that Traya has not demonstrated any skill with, beyond a general ability to pick up the residual signature left by certain individuals, such as when she detected traces of Revan's presence in the Dantooine crystal caves. While this was never outright stated, I think it's rather obvious that Farsight and Precognition are sensibilities. Traya was a master of prophecy and foresight, accurately predicting the eventual fates of the various members of the Ebon Hawk's crew, the Mandalorians, and even the Galactic Republic itself. This capability was further enhanced by her ability to perceive shatterpoints, faults in the fabric of existence that pointed to individuals or events of great significance, and granting those who could perceive them an awareness of how the actions of themselves and others affected the universe around them. Alter abilities were based around using the Force to physically influence one's environment. The powers offered up in this branch were numerous, the most obvious being telekinesis, and Traya's combative applications of this power being both brutal and insidious. She has used basic pushes and waves to batter targets into submission, grips to throttle opponents or damage their internal organs, and notably mastered the Force Whirlwind, an advanced power based around manipulating the air currents around a target in order to lift them off the ground and spin them around rapidly. Most impressively, she used telekinesis to wield up to 3 lightsabers at a time with a high degree of skill. In the realm of energy-based abilities, Traya was a master of the Sith staple, Force Lightning, a lethal projection of pseudo-electrical energy generated by the dark side. Force Stun, which allowed her to immobilize targets by overloading their nervous systems with force energy. Ionize, which allowed her to disable or destroy droids and electronics, and most notably, Force Drain. As she herself explained, the purpose of Drain was to use the connections within the Force between all life forms to siphon energy from another, parasitically feeding upon their life force in order to empower oneself. Traya was a master of this power, training Darth Nihilus in it to the point where he could drain the energy of entire worlds, and herself using it to kill the surviving Jedi Council masters on Dantooine. Based on all of her accomplishments, there is no questioning that Darth Traya was one of the most powerful Force wielders of her era. However, everything she achieved as a Sith Lord was thanks to her tactical brilliance and insight, and though extremely knowledgeable, she was not one of the all-time greats, and all of her demonstrations of power need to be taken with a grain of salt. Yes, she did insta-kill 3 Jedi Council Masters with Force Drain after manhandling them with telekinesis, but she did spend a good 3 to 5 minutes knelt in meditation gathering her energies in advance of this confrontation, and she stated outright that she was using her powers of mental manipulation to subtly influence them from afar, which heavily implies that she was using these same powers to keep them off their A-game and prevent them from bringing their full collective strength to bear against her. Similarly, while her application of telekinetic lightsaber combat was expert, she was ultimately held back by the fact that she could only wield these lightsabers as well as she knew how to wield a lightsaber, being a mere expert-level duelist and not a true swordmaster, something she clearly attempted to compensate for by employing multiple weapons. And despite what those Battlefront 2 mods would have you believe, telekinetic lightsaber combat was not Traya's default fighting mode. It was a reserve skill that she used only as a last resort. She may have been an expert at combative multitasking, but precisely manipulating 3 lightsabers with telekinesis would still be a major drain on her energy reserves. Furthermore, considering that prominent users of this technique include a Clone Wars era Jedi Padawan, wielding a lightsaber with telekinesis was not the be-all end-all of lightsaber combat. It was nothing more than a clever trick. And that right there sums up Darth Traya. She was a trickster who presented herself as all-powerful, but in truth owed her success to deception and tactical supremacy, rather than overwhelming power. She chose her battles very carefully and put rigorous effort into pre-battle preparation, whether subtly undermining her adversaries with her alternative capabilities, or amping her own powers through meditation, or by drawing upon external amplifiers, such as the dark side nexus within Atreus Academy. It is worth noting that, with the sole exception of her final duel with the Jedi Exile, all of Traya's major defeats were battles that were forced upon her, and all of her major victories were battles that she chose. To clarify, I am not arguing that Darth Traya was a weakling, as all of her accomplishments speak to a massive reserve of Force power. She was simply held back as a combative Force wielder by the simple fact that she wasn't a dedicated combative Force wielder, instead funneling most of her power into the subtler utility powers that enabled her manipulations. She put on a good show and backed it up with a solid level of actual ability, but was not as powerful as appearances would suggest, and when put between a rock and a hard place, was bound to come up short. But to her credit, she was clearly aware of this, and was generally most comfortable when operating from the shadows. The vast majority of Dark Jedi were simply failed Padawans or fallen knights, and though quite dangerous in their own right, they ultimately paled in comparison to those great masters of the dark side, the Sith Lords. Inquisitor Jerec was one of the rare exceptions to this rule, his powers having been directly compared to those of Darth Vader, to the point where it was often stated that in the absence of Vader, Jerec would have been Palpatine's first choice for Sith apprentice. Given his demonstrated capabilities, I would rank Jerec alongside Jeruis Sabayoth as being the most powerful non-Sith Darksider active during the Dark Times and the Galactic Civil War, and his very presence twisted and corrupted the Force around him. Though a lifelong academic dedicated to the pursuit of arcane knowledge, notably provided with the opportunity to study from Emperor Palpatine's Darkside Compendium, Jerec's role as a Jedi-hunting Imperial Inquisitor necessitated a heavy combative focus. In the realm of control abilities, Jerec shared Traya's mastery of Tutaminis, though he possessed no skill with Curado Salva, dark healing or otherwise. His probable use of Altus Sopor was further enhanced by Battle Mind, which allowed him to improve his focus and morale while in combat. In fact, it was likely this power which allowed him to continue fighting after Kyle Katarn disrupted his connection to the dark side. With physical augmentation, he emphasized the enhancement of agility and reflex, bolstering his fighting style. Like Traya, Jerec's most obvious sense ability was his use of Force Sight to compensate for his physical blindness, in his case an inborn ability possessed by all of his people. With the more general powers of Prima Vitae and Tactus Otium, he was capable of sensing and locating specific individuals on a planet while in orbit, and even gleaning a basic impression of what they were thinking at the time. A formidable telepath, though his skill set wasn't quite as broad as Traya's, he still boasted a high level of raw ability. Likely his most notable achievement was when he invaded the mind of the Jedi Master Ku Ron, who was actively resisting him, and gathering knowledge on the Valley of the Jedi from his memories. In fact, it is outright stated that his telepathic powers were one of the primary means through which he controlled his followers. Additionally, Ku Ron described Jerec as possessing the ability to interfere with an opponent's connection to the Force by absorbing and overshadowing it, an effect that Ron described as akin to a dark cloud. While I initially believed that Jerec employed a passive dark side version of Sever Force, Ron's description of Jerec's power more closely resembled Force Suppression, a mind-affecting power that disrupted a target's connection to the Force and mastered by the likes of Darth Cognis. Passive and subtle, this ability furthered Jerec's ability to undermine the opponent's power, though Ron noted that it could be overcome through strength of will. Alter abilities, specifically combative ones, were Jerec's primary focus. With telekinesis, he of course employed those basic powers of push and grip, but he took things a step further by effectively creating a new power, Force Destruction. Likely his most powerful application of the Force, destruction manifested itself as a glowing red ball of light that was cast at the target, giving the impression that it was an energy-based power despite being a highly specialized application of telekinesis. This in itself was not difficult to believe, as there were many examples of sufficiently powerful telekinetic attacks being accompanied by visible surges of Force energy. Given the amount of power that went into Force destruction, it was capable of punching through passive telekinetic barriers with ease, the only effective defenses being either active Force shields or Tutaminis. This power was one of the reasons for why Jerec was so lethal, as it was proven effective even against powerful Force wielders, and he could unleash it on a whim. In the hands of any other adept, Force Destruction would have been an extremely straightforward offensive ability, but Jerec employed it very inventively, using a precise control over the power's energy levels to produce different results against different targets. The baseline version of the ability, which he used to disable Ku Ron, was extremely dramatic in effect. If the target wasn't simply killed outright, they would be left momentarily paralyzed and therefore defenseless. The high-powered version of the ability was capable of blasting apart a docking array strong enough to bear the weight of an Imperial cargo ship. What was even more impressive was that he aimed this power so precisely that it grazed Kyle Katarn, throwing him off his feet without seriously harming him. While the novella did establish that this application was largely enabled by Jerec drawing upon the latent power of the Valley of the Jedi, I see this as actually reflecting even better on him. Most Force wielders, when provided with external amplifiers that enhance their connection to the Force, lost control of their powers, incapable of closing the floodgates after opening them. By contrast, not only did Jerec retain his control, he retained his fine control. He took something that in the hands of anyone else would have been nothing more than a blunt instrument and employed it in a surprisingly nuanced manner to achieve a very specific goal. If he had wanted to kill Katarn right there, he could have done so easily. But he didn't, because he merely wanted to remove Katarn from play. He wanted to turn Katarn to the dark side and recruit him as a follower. And while that wasn't a possibility in this situation, it was still something that could be accomplished down the road. When examining the flip side of the coin that is Jerec's Force abilities, his role-playing game character sheet specifically credits him with advanced Force defenses, confirming him as a practitioner of Tutaminis, and of course entailing strong telekinetic and telepathic barriers, to the point where he could put up an active Force shield. For such a powerful Darksider, it really is no surprise that Jerec was capable of Force Lightning, and it served as one of his primary offensive abilities. Furthermore, there is a strong implication that Jerec is capable of Force Drain, specifically the Death Field application, as he was able to create a bubble of darkside energy that caused the tentacles of the entity known as Spore to wither and die upon contact. He is also a practitioner of Consume Essence, a power which enabled him to feed upon the negative emotions and power of other Darksiders. Many of Jerec's powers were developed with the goal of countering Jedi powers, though his faculty with Tutaminis was likely built up as preparation for a confrontation with the Sith Lords, as Jerec was long planning to betray the Emperor and seize power for himself. In keeping with this goal, Jerec's skill set was multi-purpose and surprisingly deceptive, developing his powers with the outward purpose of overpowering Jedi, but the true purpose of combating Darksiders, specifically those more powerful than himself. Consume Essence allowed him to use their powers to amplify his own, and Force Suppression allowed him to undermine them and prevent them from bringing their full power to bear. As Force Destruction was unique to him and his immediate followers, it allowed him to bypass the defenses of virtually any adversary by attacking them with a power that they simply didn't know how to combat. This method was enhanced by his deft integration of his abilities with his lightsaber skills, blindsiding adversaries with sudden bursts of dark power in the midst of lightsaber duels. This skillful integration also granted Jerec a substantial logistical advantage, making him a threat even against opponents who knew how to defend against his unique abilities. Inquisitor Jerec's powers and skills were so advanced and well developed that in basically any other era, not only would the Sith Order have welcomed him with open arms, but he would have been a serious contender for the title of Dark Lord of the Sith. As it stood, the only thing that held him back was the fact that he was stuck serving under two of the most powerful Sith Lords in galactic history, and it's worth noting that he came within a hair's breadth of overcoming even this obstacle. Though Jerec may have fewer feats to his name, they are no less compelling than anything Traya has accomplished, which I see as an indication that they possessed similar levels of innate Force power. The main difference between them is that Traya was a very general-purpose Force wielder, where Jerec funneled more of his power into combative abilities, which resulted in a narrower, though more applicable skill set. In the realm of control abilities, the most relevant powers are Tutaminis and Force Heal, and though Jerec only possesses the former, the latter merely improves Traya's survivability. With sense abilities, Traya may possess a significantly broader skill set, particularly with telepathy, but Jerec's raw ability makes up the difference, which results in a great deal of cancelling out. While Traya could obviously influence Jarek from afar if allowed to operate without him being aware, the idea behind the Versus series is a fair contest on neutral ground, with both combatants being dropped in cold, and in such a situation, Jarek would be on the lookout for that sort of attack and would be able to mount a defense. Traya's knowledge of Shatterpoint pertained entirely to her grand manipulations and visions of the future, and she has never applied it in combat. Jarek's use of force suppression would be almost useless against such a powerful telepath as Traya. With alter abilities, Traya possessed a broader palette of skills, but Jarek had counters for everything she brought to the table. Though Traya possessed a wider array of telekinetic attacks, they were all effectively nullified by Jarek's highly refined force defenses. Ditto with force stun. Both were capable masters of force lightning, so that cancelled out. But as I see it, what really tips this in Jarek's favor is a comparison of what I would term their special abilities. Force Drain in Traya's corner and Force Destruction in Jarek's. As I outlined in the Traya breakdown, I don't see Force Drain as some unbeatable trump card, but rather as analogous to Darth Zana's flesh-disintegrating dark-side tendrils. It calls for extensive concentration and effort, which makes it impractical in combat. Traya has only used Force Drain on that level once, and the one time she did it, she spent over 5 minutes knelt in meditation in advance. Needless to say, this is not something she's going to be firing off at the drop of a hat. By contrast, Jarek can and does fire off Force Destruction on command and extremely frequently, and even the baseline version of the power can be used to devastating effect. Another factor that must be considered is the novelty value of Force Destruction, as it is a unique ability created by Jarek and was exclusive to him and his immediate followers. As Jarek aspired to become Galactic Emperor, he effectively dedicated his life to preparing for a likely confrontation with Palpatine, assessing the strengths and weaknesses of the Sith Master as best he could, and tailoring his own skill set to neutralize those strengths and exploit those weaknesses. While I don't think that Jarek's unique powers would have availed him much against the Emperor, as Palpatine kept close tabs on his servants and likely took some preparatory measures of his own, but against Darth Traya, the novelty of his abilities provides him with a significant advantage. The same can't be said for Traya, as all of her powers were conventional and common, and she was instead set apart by the sheer breadth of her skill set and her advanced applications of virtually every power in her arsenal. The fact that Traya had refined so many of her powers to such a degree clearly indicates that she is the more powerful and skillful Force wielder, but compared to Jarek, she has spread herself too thin, and hasn't developed her combative abilities to the same degree he has. Though her attempts to compensate with clever tactics, unconventional applications, and rigorous pre-battle preparations were overwhelmingly successful, they simply wouldn't be enough against Jarek, as he relied on many of the same tricks. Telekinetic lightsaber combat would gain her nothing, as Jarek would no doubt respond by immediately blasting her with his powers. Inquisitor Jarek gets the edge as a Force wielder. Darth Traya and Inquisitor Jarek were very much in the same boat, in that their raw Force power was eclipsed by that of their peers, yet both were able to use their cunning and their arcane knowledge to master their situations, oftentimes without their rivals even being aware of this. This resulted in many similarities between the two. Neither were dedicated swordsmen wielding lightsabers purely out of necessity and building versatile skill sets that allowed them to contend with anything leveled against them while relying on alternative means to retaliate, up to and including insidious psychological warfare tactics. As Force wielders, both favored academic pursuits, though not at the expense of practical skill, applying their arcane knowledge in a manner that bolstered their more conventional abilities. Traya's approach to combat was that of a Nyman specialist. Rather than trying to achieve supremacy through absolute mastery of a single given skill or technique, she borrowed elements from all disciplines, tailoring her approach to suit the opponent in question and using whatever configuration of skills necessary to negate their strengths and exploit their weaknesses. The problem is that this approach was basically useless against a fighter like Jerec. As a dedicated Jedi hunter, Jerec built his skill sets specifically for engagements with other Force wielders, specializing in the superior dueling form Makashi and mastering an array of powerful combative abilities, both conventional and esoteric, allowing him to effectively defend against anything that was brought to bear against him, while also attacking in ways that few opponents were prepared to deal with. Traya was further held back by her own heavy focus on utility skills, as a major element in her operating style was undermining potential enemies off the battlefield, ensuring that overcoming them on the battlefield was much easier, if not completely unnecessary. However, this was all relative, as lower caliber Force wielders would find Darth Traya so overwhelmingly powerful that she would be practically untouchable. Unfortunately for her, a lower caliber Force wielder, Jerec, was not. The dynamic between Darth Traya and Inquisitor Jarek is very similar to that between Sherlock Holmes and Professor Moriarty, as presented in Sherlock Holmes: A Game of Shadows. Like Holmes and Moriarty, Traya and Jerec are fair competition for one another when placed on opposite ends of the chessboard, both being exceptionally cunning master manipulators. However, Moriarty and Jerec lacked their adversaries' flexibility, and though capable of anticipating and preempting many of the opponent's moves, they ultimately leaned very heavily on their power bases to make up for the fact that they often couldn't see the forest for the trees. Holmes and Traya, on the other hand, both proved that they could quickly assemble small groups of very well-placed followers, allowing them to effectively undermine larger and more established power bases, and their ability to maintain their attention to detail while remaining conscious of the big picture allowed them to perform moves that their adversaries either failed to perceive or, more disastrously, failed to understand. Jerec is a master manipulator, but he is no Lord of Betrayal. However, once the grand chess game ended and the inevitable physical confrontation finally took place, Traya, like Holmes, would find herself coming up short. While Traya was more skillful, more experienced, and ultimately more hands-on than Jerec, the nature of her role forced her to spread herself thin between a wide variety of skills, trading lethality for versatility and offensive might for tactical viability. By contrast, Jerec was under no such constraints, able to use his followers as his instruments to achieve his goals while leaving himself free to funnel his power down avenues of his own choosing, ironically making him the more balanced combatant, his tactical viability feeding into his martial might rather than detracting from it. In Jerec, Traya would find an opponent who possessed both a much stronger combative focus and an intimate familiarity with all of her tricks, as they were the very tricks that he himself relied on. Incapable of outwitting this enemy, she would be forced to meet him head-on, and she would simply crumble under the pressure. I declare Inquisitor Jarek the victor.